Good evening, everybody. Welcome to a Tuesday Space Show program starting an hour earlier, 6 p.m. Pacific time rather than 7. I'm still taking survey input. If those of you who listen live, prefer the 6 p.m. or the 7 p.m. time slot. So if you still want to sound off about that, please email me at drspace, DRSPACE, at thespaceshow.com. If you're an archive listener, none of this matters to you. Tonight, well, a couple of quick things. The Friday show is unknown because some people claim they want to do a show, and the guy claims he's putting it together with the people he wants on the show. And I haven't heard from him, and I need time to put a show together and to PR it. So I really don't know. But I will make the announcement. So Frank White, who many of you know from the Overview Effect, is also involved in a couple of space nonprofits, wants to go to space on a Blue Origin space rocket. And so he has started a program with some of the organizations that he is associated with to help fund his ride on the D-Ride, amusement park ride, Blue Origin. Okay. So I don't really know what it costs to send him to space or what it costs to buy a Blue Origin ticket, because you can't just go online and buy a ticket. It's kind of what I understand what Jeff and Blue Origin want to do and how they want to price it for you, or do they want to offer you a freebie or a discount or something like that. So I don't know the amount they're going to raise. And so I said, if you're really trying to do that, I'm willing to do an hour-long show for you guys to talk about why you want to do this. And you can talk about your nonprofits, and you can let Frank come back on the show if he wants to. He's been on many, many times, and make a pitch to send him to space. So as I used to be taught in the real estate sales business, never, ever be attached to the outcome. And you can do a much better job in selling and accomplishing your goals than if you are emotionally tied up and attached to the outcome. So I'm not attached to the outcome as to whether we have a Friday show this week or not. So if it happens, you'll, on the advisory board, be getting messages from me, and others will see it appear on the upcoming show menu. But tonight, none other than Bob Zimmerman is with us. And after Bob, on Sunday, we have the chap from TransAstra who has made big, big news. Bob may even want to comment on this later in the show about bringing in an asteroid to do all sorts of great work with it closer to Earth, kind of like what Obama wanted, sort of, as an asteroid retrieval program. And we had a couple of other guests that had ideas to lasso or get a small asteroid and bring it in to develop it or work with it or mine it. So that's sort of what TransAstra is doing. And so he will be with us, the CEO, on Sunday for Zoom. But for tonight, we have Bob with us on a very active Jared Isaacman NASA YouTube, NASA TV day, where he's the star of all the emails that I'm getting, not Bob, but Jared. And and by the way, Bob has great books. All of them are talked about on space show programs, but also he has a terrific bio on our website, spaceshow.com, for Bob Zimmerman. I urge you, if you don't know who he is, to find out who he is. And I would really tell you to read his books because they are fundamentals of getting us into commercial space where we are today. Bob, did you spend all day on the NASA program? I think it was about an 8-hour deluge from Jared. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was among everybody else spending the day. I'm sure most of the the crew here to listen to these. My trick is I don't actually watch it live. I usually wait until it's over because then I can run it at 2 times speed and skip the propaganda videos and the blather, and so I can get to the heart of the matter. So I did that for two of the three presentations. The second one having to do with ISS and their space station reconfiguration program that I had to kind of watch live, and that was tedious at times because they spend a lot of day with Isaacman. I will tell you, they spend a lot less time with propaganda blather, but they still do it, and it's a waste of time to listen to. I just want to know what the meat is. Yeah, so I listened to all three. I actually have a large essay, a report up this on Behind the Black, outlining in detail what they are deciding to do. And the fundamental, it's into three parts. Number one has to do with the Artemis lunar program, and number two has to do with replacing ISS, the space station program, and number three has to do with a baby that is dear to Jared Isaacman's heart, nuclear propulsion, and tying that to Mars. So I'm going to go through all three right now because the fundamental of the whole thing he's done is he's doing what NASA management has failed to do now for almost 40 years, maybe longer, as a general rule. He's focusing on developing a rational program for doing the things that need to be done. I mean, a real rational program. Just to give you an idea, Artemis, as designed before he arrived, was absurd. They were going to do a mission around the moon, circle the moon on the first manned mission, and then land on the second. It never made any sense, and it never really was real. All right, so let's talk about these three components. The first component is the moon. He has a commitment. He has to get to the moon. Trump wants to beat China to the moon, and they also want to build a moon base there. And so he said, well, what are those things involved? They mean going to the moon, the surface of the moon. So he has completely restructured the Artemis lunar program, focusing it on the surface of the moon. This means, and for legal reasons, they didn't say cancel. They have paused. I say that with a smile. They have paused Lunar Gateway, and they are right now trying to figure out ways to repurpose its already built components and also allow its international partners to find something else, how to reshift what they were going to do. Now, he can't legally cancel it because the reconciliation bill that was passed in the fall requires them to fund money for Lunar Gateway. But he's essentially doing that. He is doing that because he says if we're going to get to the moon, we got to focus on the moon. They made it a point in the presentations that they talked to the various private sector participants, and this involves Blue Origin and SpaceX, who are building the lunar landers, and they both begged NASA to get rid of the halo orbit that Lunar Gateway was in, because Lunar Gateway's orbit makes it more difficult to get to the moon. It's not as safe, and it causes them enormous problems. They want to simplify the program to get to the surface. And so basically they looked at the program and said, no, Gateway's extraneous to this. So they have paused it at the moment, but it's gone. It's going to go away. And they have instead focused the entire program now on developing surface operations. And they talked about doing it in 3 phases. And they went into a lot of details here, but you got to understand, they admitted this, and this is true. A lot of what we're talking about here is preliminary. They are in negotiations and discussions with the private sector. They want the private sector to do it for them. This is not going to be NASA built. NASA may be conceived, but it's going to be in conjunction with what this private sector can do. And they say that they're putting out RFIs, requests for information right now, not actual contracts from the private sector. And that's going out yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So a lot of this is preliminary, but the basic structure of the program on the moon is going to be 3 phases. The first phase is to test and to place some basic infrastructure, such as preliminary solar power and communications equipment and so forth, and do that by using the smaller unmanned lunar landers. And this is something Isaacman had said beforehand. His goal is to do up to 30 unmanned robotic landings in the next 3 years, starting next year in 27. That's almost one a month. Not quite, once every 2 months. And there's going to be great additional contracts issued very quickly to give the lunar lander companies that and others maybe. So, I mean, that's very aggressive. And that's that plan. And so the first phase is that initial establishment of an infrastructure. The second phase is to put in what they called foundational components during intermittent man landings. And the third will be long-term human occupancy. Now, they hope to get the first manned mission is going to be in 28 if this schedule happens. That's on Artemis 4 and 5. In the three-phase program, the first phase, they hope that they will start that third phase in 2033, which means around 2030, they hope to have intermittent occupancy of this lunar base. That's the basic concept. Once again, everything about this is very preliminary, but not only does it pause Lunar Gateway, I'll keep using their term, but it really is designed very clearly to phase out SLS as soon as possible because they make it clear they are going to be talking to the private sector to provide launch facilities. All right, I'm going to actually have an essay on Behind the Black tomorrow about this, but the way this was phrased, actually one reporter asked them about SLS. Are you phasing out SLS? And Lori Glazer, that's the name. I might have it wrong. Yeah. She kind of fudged the answer. She was vague. And I think the reason for this is strategy. They don't want to bluntly say we're phasing out SLS because it has too many allies. They got to get the pins in order with alternatives from the private sector, and they're going to be doing this so that they have those alternatives ready to go and planned and actually maybe even contracts issued so that they can then say, we have now moved to a better option that's going to be flying and flying frequently. So they don't want to say this publicly. It's a political maneuver. But yes, this program is also to phase out SLS and to do things like hire SpaceX's Starship Super Heavy, maybe Falcon Heavy. I'm sure AJ will appreciate that. And also maybe Blue Origin's New Glenn in its various phases, maybe encourage Blue Glenn to build the most powerful versions of New Glenn and maybe do it a little faster. We'd all love that. So that's the main lunar plan. That's the function of it. As far as I can tell, it's structured logically. And it's building with small efforts to begin with to greater challenges. And above all, it's focused on letting the private sector do it, getting the private sector online to do it, to energize them, to make it happen. Like that's the space station, that's the lunar portion. Then ISS. They started out saying right off the bat, both NASA, both Isaacman and also the person running the ISS, the space station program, that they don't have the funds to fund two private space stations, to issue contracts to both, which is their preference. They don't want to have one. They also indicated they're not even sure they have enough funds to fund one station sufficiently to make it as safe for their terms, to their satisfaction. And they do not think presently, though they're not convinced, but they do not think that there's enough commercial market to make up the difference. They don't think that the commercial market right now is yet present to fund the stations with the difference that's needed. Now, they also were asked this question several times, and they said, we're not convinced we're right here. We're going to be talking to the various space station companies that are putting forth proposals because they might have better information. And I've documented some Behind the Black. For example, both VAST and Starlab have been making the rounds with a lot of third world countries, signing preliminary contracts that very clearly to me say those are customers down the road when they've proven themselves to fly as passengers. So there might be money there, but the NASA isn't convinced it is. So they want to restructure the program. They don't wish to try to just fund a space station outright with a major contract. Instead, they've come up with what they call an evolutionary assemble. And those who are familiar with the various space station proposals being constructed right now, this is going to sound a lot like the Axiom space station. They want to build what they call a core module, with a lot of docking ports, two front and aft, and then four around the perimeter. And they said very clearly, we want that. So two things can happen. One, you can have more tourist missions to ISS because there's a shortage of docking ports at ISS, limiting tourist missions. And in addition, those extra docking ports could be used by commercial modules that can launch later. So they want to launch this core module and attach it to ISS. Sounds like Axiom once again. And then they want to make it available to private companies to do tourist flights and to maybe put their own modules to it as a step to developing their own stations. In the interim, this would be a step towards maybe making this a new NASA station. It would be government run that would detach from ISS when it came time to retire it. But the goal is to maybe use it as a jumping off point for a variety of multiple commercial space stations. They attach their modules to begin with there, they build up, and then they move and separate them off and have their own station. That's at least this preliminary idea. It struck me that listening to this, Axiom's got the inside track because it could offer a very quick station redesign for its first module, or maybe its second, to have those docking ports and get this contract to do the core module. But that's not guaranteed. It could be that this plan will supplement Axiom, but they have to put it out to contract, so it's open to anybody. Once again, what the goal here was to come up with a more cost-effective way for NASA. As Isaacman himself said, we can't ignite an industry, a market in space stations. We can't generate it is the word they use, but we can maybe ignite it, maybe do some things to help it grow. And that's what the goal with this evolutionary station design is. That's their plan. Whether it's going to work or not, I don't know. Once again, we have to be aware this is preliminary. They're putting up requests for information right now, and they're going to get feedback from the private sector, and we'll see how it plays out. And the third component of the announcements today that I found interesting was Mars and nuclear propulsion. Isaacman is really into this. He negotiated a partnership with the Department of Energy to build a nuclear propulsion engine to use to get from planet to planet. And this is something NASA's talked about since the 60s. They had the NERVA project then, which actually was very close to being operational. It wasn't ever launched, though, because of political concerns. And so he wants to get this engine developed. He wants to put it on a spaceship that would carry a fleet of Ingenuity class helicopters to Mars. And they want it to launch by the end of 28. Now, of all the things proposed, this is the only thing in this proposal that is almost completely a government NASA project or a government project. The engine is being built in partnership with the Department of Energy. The fleet of engines the fleet of helicopters would be Ingenuity, which is basically JPL, which means it's basically a NASA design. The only thing would be the spaceship to go. I've seen some comments on my website suggesting maybe they're going to use the power module, the Lunar Gateway power module that's under development, I think by Northrop Grumman. But I don't know if that's a fact. That's just a suggestion on my website. I thought of Starship as a candidate, but the point is, most of this project is government, which to my mind means it's the least likely to happen. And the data end of 28 seems very premature, very early. And they had no discussion of how that fleet of helicopters would get from this interplanetary nuclear-powered ship down to the surface. They did talk about how after they've deployed the helicopters, they could maybe send it off someplace else, maybe even Uranus. That was discussed. But they haven't decided any of that yet. It's very preliminary, and it sounds to me like it's a lot of government pie in the sky. But because it's a project that I think Isaacman has a personal commitment to, he likes the power. My pessimism might be wrong. He could really force something through. All of these plans, all the dates and everything, as I say, I'm behind the black. This is equivalent of Elon Musk's schedule. It's very fast. It's a timeline that is probably the overall plan makes sense, but it will likely take longer than anticipated to achieve. Um, its greatest virtue, though, how it's focused on the moon and on the reality of costs with the space station. And it's gotten rid of the ridiculous Lunar Gateway, and it's focusing on going where we want to go. I mean, Isaacman himself said during the various one of the press conferences that with Gateway we'd be up on in space watching the Chinese have fun on the moon. And that's what I've said now since Gateway was first proposed. It's a bad idea. And so this, I think, is overall, it's a good first step to getting the program focused in an intelligent, rational way. And I'll add one more thing. It's just that it's focused on using the private sector to make it happen. And that's the best part.
Take Marshall's question, Bob.
Yes. I noticed that they kept using the number $20 billion. And
let me cut right in. I saw that in a CNBC article about this. I listened to the whole report and I didn't come across, I don't remember any specific number being thrown out at any particular point. The number that what Isaacman said about $20 billion several times is that in previous programs, NASA wasted $20 billion and got nothing done. He said that several times about several programs.
Okay.
But at no point did they throw out any figures having to do with this budget. He did talk about how what we're trying to do is reuse the budget we have. And he was very clear about this. We have resources. We have a lot of budget here. We've wasted a lot. That's when he brought up the $20 billion. I want to focus on spending the money intelligently and maybe be able to do more with it, which is why he said Lunar Gateway is paused. He wants to use that money for something else. So that once again, there's no 20 billion from them, none at all that I saw.
That means that he's still got to get it through Congress, and there's where I think the big
no, actually not.
No.
I already wrote about this in Behind the Black when the NASA authorization bill was passed by Senate. It was very clear that the Senate, the headline on my essay was, "The Senate cries uncle on SLS." They very clearly were accepting Isaacman's reconfiguration of the Artemis program that was clearly devaluing SLS. And the language of the authorization bill almost gives Isaacman carte blanche to reconfigure the entire program. It was clear in that. It was very clear with the proviso that he used the private sector. So that even more says he's got the freedom to do this. Now, I'm going to write an essay tomorrow about this because he has been very, I have had a lot of reservations about him because of some things he said and done. But my impression of this whole laying out his program since he became administrator is now beginning to appear to me to be a very clever series of political moves to diffuse opposition in Congress, to get them on his side, to do almost anything he wants to do. And he doesn't want to just do anything. He wants to focus the program more on more efficient ways to do things. And of course, what are the inefficiencies? SLS, Orion, Lunar Gateway. And so he's very clearly shifted the politics in this direction. And in the process of this step-by-step announcement, he has been discussing this with people like Cruz and others in the Congress, and he's gotten them on his side. And the proof was, once again, the authorization bill, which basically approved what he's doing. And so I don't think it's a concern. I mean, there might be some budgetary issues, and we all know that Congress will try to stick its nose in to put in maybe earmarks or its own particular things. But he's playing this game. And once again, I had doubts, but right now I'm very impressed with how he's playing this game to get the program away from these inefficiencies and to do it in a way that he'll have Congress on his side. Use SLS as an example. They didn't outright say that they're phasing SLS out at this meeting because they didn't want to offend people. But they also said they're going to be looking at getting other launch providers. So the way politically to get rid of SLS is to have those other launch providers online and preparing to do launches as alternatives or in parallel. And because they're hiring and giving jobs in Texas and elsewhere, the opposition is going to go away. to getting rid of SLS at that point. So I think that's the situation. And once again, I'm increasingly impressed. It's a government program once again, and anyone who's heard me on this show before, I hate a government space program. I don't want a space program. I want a space industry of many companies competing. But it is at least a program that's rational and focused on using that private sector. And this is what I argued in December, right after the election, a year and a half ago. They shouldn't focus on the moon. They should focus on building up a big private sector in low Earth orbit. Well, he's smarter than I am. That's why he's NASA Administrator. He's taking it a step farther. He's going to try to do both within the resources he has. And there's a lot of merit to that because the lunar program, of course, generates a lot of excitement, and that's public relations. So I'm positively impressed. One of the commenters on Behind the Black to my report on this, and if you guys aren't reading Behind the Black, you're making a mistake. One of the commenters asked a very pointed question: how does this program influence Elon Musk's data centers on the moon, or how does it influence the orbital constellations that a number of companies want to build? And I pointed out in response that they're separate. They're separate, but they're interrelated. NASA's work is not related to the data centers either on the moon or in orbit, but its work will help those operations because it will be involving an increase in technology. But for the data centers on the moon and on Earth, the Artemis program they don't need the Artemis program to do what they want to do, but they'll take advantage of the technology that will come out of having NASA buying a lot of products from the private sector. They are separate. It's not going to influence the private, and Elon Musk might very well, once again, I still think he's the space program because, they said very clearly the next Artemis mission is going to be orbital missions, an orbital mission to test the lunar landers, one or both with Orion in Earth orbit. There's no question in my mind that Blue Origin's lunar lander is not going to be ready next year. SpaceX there's a good shot it'll be ready. This whole program, of course, could face delays. As I say, it's an Elon Musk timetable, but I don't think Blue Origin is going to be ready in time. So SpaceX is the program right now, and that's okay with me. It's not a problem.
I just wanted to say that twice, actually, Jared, and I'm completely agreeing with you. Jared has done a great job here, of putting everything together in a rational manner. But only twice he already said that the top line of $25 billion that NASA has is enough. That is not what the problem is. And the problem has been, of course, the other waste of money. The other thing I'll mention is that Carlos, when he was talking, he did bring up the numbers a couple of times, and that was $10 billion for up to 28, I guess, or up to 2030, another 10 billion from 30 to 32, 33, and another 10 billion for phase 3. So those are the only numbers that I saw during the presentation.
Well, let me interrupt for a sec, AJ. I'm not disputing you. But once again, those numbers were outlining money within the overall NASA budget.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay, so he's giving you a scale of what they want to do within that budget, which when you add up the monies they've been spending, those are not unreasonable numbers at all. No, $3 billion on this, $3 billion on that. They've wasted $3 billion a year almost on Orion. And you take that away, and you suddenly have a billion here, a billion there. So we're talking real money.
They're going to save money from not having NRHO, not having Gateway, and all that money can go into something that Carlos was talking about, which was really very, very interesting and very nice, and the right thing to do about lunar settlements.
I have to tell you, AJ, you were probably more interested in that specifics than me because I'm not an engineer, even though I'm interested. I didn't pay as much attention to that because, especially with this third phase, it's very, preliminary, and it's fantasy land. It's not that they shouldn't do it. I'm not just criticizing, but I don't pay as much attention because things are going to change. But their eyes are on the right prize. The plan is intelligent step by step, but
Right.
they recognize every step of the way, and in these early stages, especially, the whole thing could change as we go. And that's I just want to point that out.
Yeah, and he was talking about clips 2, and in terms of the payload capacity increasing from 3 to 4 ton, then 4 to 5 ton, then 5 to 8 ton. So all of those things also made sense. I'm sure I agree with you that it's going to be longer than whatever they are talking about, and might not exactly follow that timeline, but it doesn't matter that much, because I think what they're trying to do is the right thing.
Yeah, it's one of the other things that was announced today in these press conferences, which it's going to be a separate press release, and I'll post it tomorrow on Behind the Black but you'll get this struck me really interesting. They've issued another contract to Intuitive Machines to go to the moon, do a lunar lander, and I can't remember the payload. They were making a big deal about the payload. I don't remember what it is. It doesn't really matter. What was really fascinating to me was the graphic of the Intuitive Machines lander. It was suddenly half the height and wide. Somebody has told them that a tall lunar lander has a high center of gravity and it tips over. And so it took them 2 or 3 missions to realize this, and they're redesigning their lunar lander, I think, with this in mind. But once again, they have already issued one contract down the road. We have to recognize that this ambitious goal of Isaacman to do 30 unmanned lunar landers over the next 3 years, over the 3 years beginning in 27, is incredibly ambitious, considering the fact that of all the commercial companies, both American and Japanese, that have tried to land on the moon, all have failed in every attempt except Firefly's Blue Ghost. And so maybe they've gotten some of the mistakes out of the way and they'll be more successful. But this is an extremely ambitious Elon Musk timeline, and we must recognize that it is probably not going to happen as they promise. But it's laid out in a logical manner. So if there are delays and problems, you're in the right direction every step of the way to build upon your mistakes and errors. And because it's aggressive, it means it hopefully won't lose momentum with a failure, because they'll have more ships down the line. Once again, though, we have a caveat. I'll still put more money on the private outside of this that's trying to happen, because there was one question from a reporter: what happens if there's administration change? And it was a kind of a stupid question, because we all know what happens if there's administration change. Everything gets thrown out the window. You can't trust anything that's been planned. However, what Isaacman is doing is very similar to what the Obama administration did, once forced by Senate and Congress to do SLS. They're creating a program that is more foundational, more interweaved with the political world. Excuse me.
Yeah.
And so by doing that, it makes it more difficult for later presidents to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that what happened with Obama with the commercial program that they established, Trump did not abandon it, and neither did Biden. Did not abandon it. It may be moved with different acceleration or slow down with different presidents, but they didn't abandon it. And I think what Isaacman's created here is pretty solid. I'll still put my money on the private sector, and I hope that the private sector responds to this positively and in a way that allows them to move beyond anything NASA's proposing here.
Bob, is it too early? Have you seen any congressional commentary on what was talked about?
I haven't seen any. I haven't looked. I would say that based upon what Isaacman said, he says he was in touch with all the people in Congress, and based on everything that's happened in the last few months, I don't think there's going to be a lot of opposition to any of this. He says he's in control. He's been communicating with Europe, ESA, having to do with Lunar Gateway. There were some conflicts about whether or not they had been up to snuff with this as early as he said in the press conference. Some reporter pointed out that they weren't aware in a recent conference, but I think they were from other things I've seen. I have a feeling that the opposition here is going to be very minimal because he's laying out an aggressive program, which is going to do what Congress wants, which is to have a moon program and provide lots of jobs. But he's not doing it with big NASA projects. He's doing it with the private sector coming up with their own spaceships and rockets and lunar landers that they own, not NASA. That's the key to this. They own it, not NASA.
Marshall?
I noticed in the 2 hours that I watched, they really were very fuzzy on where their prime landing location would be. I guess it's the South Pole, but
no,
I didn't notice it being
no.
mentioned.
They were being as coy with that as they were with phasing out SLS. But it's also they weren't being for less for political reasons, I think, and more having to do with it's too preliminary to make any final decisions. They did talk about the South Pole and the reasons to go there and why they would like to go there. But they also, and I've also seen other indications that they're looking. I posted this about 2 or 3 days ago. What is it? Space Policy Online, I think. Maybe it was another site. But they noticed that during a presentation at a conference, one of NASA officials that was at this the guy, oh, I can't remember his name. He pointed out that they are considering alternatives to the South Pole. He wasn't as blunt as that, but it was very clear. He was hinting they're looking at alternatives for the early missions. And that makes sense once again, because the South Pole is more difficult. And it might make sense on the first landings. And this is getting back to Isaacman's general philosophy. Let's build steadily, step by step. It would make more sense the first time you do this with these new spacecraft to go someplace where it's relatively easy. And the equator makes more sense where there's flat mare. It makes more sense. China has already pretty much indicated, though they haven't confirmed it, that they're looking at a near equator location for their first manned mission, not the South Pole. They haven't confirmed this, but there are studies that have been published by Chinese scientists talking about other sites. And I think that's real. I don't think that's a mistake. They're going to try to land a lunar Chang'e 7, I think is the number. I'd have to go to my website to look. I'm not going to do that.
That's correct.
Now. But I think it's Chang'e 7, right at the South Pole, at Shackleton's Rim. Yeah. And that's coming up, I think, later this year or next, soon. But the manned mission, they might not do it at the moon. And I think they've indicated that. And I think NASA's now looking at this in the same vein. What's logical? How should we do this sensibly? Now, I point out in my essay today on Behind the Black that there is one aspect of everything Isaacman has done here that is not rational and is out of sequence with everything else. And that remains Artemis 2, launching in a week. Because that mission, it continues to make no sense to send that mission with 4 astronauts on a 10-day flight around the moon with a questionable heat shield and an untested life support system. It is not what they did in Apollo. And when they did Apollo 8, excuse me, my voice. When they did Apollo 8, there were very extraneous Cold War considerations that put them under very serious time pressure. We're not under that kind of time pressure politically with China right now, not even close. So this mission is out of sequence and it's not rational. It's a leftover, I think, from the previous NASA planning that made no sense. And and Isaacman is kind of stuck with it for political reasons. I think canceling it or changing it to an orbital mission, he, I think, has recognized would hurt his political strategy with Congress. So let's all cross our fingers and pray that no one dies on Artemis 2. The impact of Artemis 2, I have no idea how it would impact all of Isaacman's program here. He actually might be announcing this now ahead of Artemis 2 to get in before that failure, hoping that the existence of the program here will mitigate the political consequences of a disaster on Artemis 2. I think he knows there is a chance, and he doesn't want to, he's covering himself right now. Marshall, you raised your hand again.
Marshall, you're muted.
Yeah, I was just crossing my fingers along with you.
Oh, I see. You weren't raising your hand. Okay.
Anyway, that does bring up another interesting point, and that is if you're doing 30 unmanned missions, you can take a nice reproduced modular unit that does a good exploration of each landing site, and that would be a big boon to whoever is trying to make a laboratory, a space station on the moon, as to how to build it and what you can and can't do. And
I think
that's a big
Marshall,
one.
I think Marshall, they outlined a lot of the technical stuff about what they want to do on each phase here.
Mhm.
They didn't specify landing sites, but if I was me, and I'm sure Isaacman knows smarter than this, if it was me, those 30 missions, I'd send some of them to the South Pole, and they are going to do that. They were pretty clear about that.
Mhm.
To not only do exploration, there's like going into Shackleton, look for the water, see if there really is any.
Mhm.
But also to lay down some of that preliminary infrastructure for a later moon base. At the same time, there's no reason why a lot of these landers can't go to other alternative locations where they might want to do a preliminary lunar landing on the first Artemis landing mission. No reason why you can't, let's say, you find a location near the equator that you think you want to go to, maybe go back to one of the Apollo sites even, and you send a lunar lander nearby to send some preliminary supplies or equipment ahead of game. I mean, that's another option. If you're going to do 30 missions in 3 years, that's 10 a year. That's almost monthly. You have options to do multiple different things. And this is another aspect of this, though they're talking science. They always want to do science. They always say that. Much of NASA's program, and I've complained about this on Behind the Block, much of NASA's program has been so focused on science that it has sometimes excluded the engineering aspect of developing human colonies in other worlds, such as Mars. All the missions have gone near the equator pretty much. None of them have gone to potential colony sites. All of it's been science-based. It's discover the geology. And that's not a bad thing because you need to learn that before you go. But at the same time, it's all been focused on science. It's very clear from the program announced today that the focus is not number one science. The focus is number one engineering to build a lunar base and to build a manned American presence on other worlds. That's a big cultural change. Once again, they made a big deal about science. They had a whole section on science. They talked a great deal about a lot of what they want to do. And they plugged their science missions like Roman and Webb and Hubble. And they did all this typical blather that they do in those kind of things. But the actual lunar program that's been laid out and the space station program that's been laid out and the Mars propulsion mission that's been laid out, they're all focused on engineering. They made it very clear, for example, that those helicopters are not going to be any better than Ingenuity, which are basically engineering tests. They'll be able to do science and do some research, but the program is focused on the engineering. And that is a major cultural shift, and that's a big deal. And I think the situation is that with an engineer in charge of NASA, I think he'll pull that off. He won't have a lot of resistance because he's making it clear he doesn't want to cut the science at NASA, so he's not going to make enemies there.
Yeah. The next fun thing that I noticed that was missing, at least from what I saw, was the communications. They used the word constellation several times and implied they were going to do some kind of constellation where no matter where you were on the moon, he could communicate back, which
Yeah,
means a
that
crosstalk.
actually isn't a major change, or maybe they're working to refine it or redesign it because Halo orbit's no longer in the mix. But they've always intended to have communication relay satellites. For example, Firefly on its next Blue Ghost mission is going to deploy a communications satellite in orbit around the moon to act as a relay satellite. And it's going to stay in lunar orbit to provide additional research after Blue Ghost finishes its mission. And so they've definitely always intended to put orbiters around the moon to provide communications, possibly GPS, though they've done some other work to prove GPS can be done in that kind of location work can be done in other ways. But nonetheless, they always plan that. And so anything they're talking here, I should also add, one of the reasons I didn't pay as much attention to the specifics of the Muna aspect is because as I looked at the PowerPoint, as I skimmed through them, none of this is really new. They've been looking at all these things now for several years, and private companies have already latched onto this, proposing their own ideas to try to put themselves ahead of the game to win the contracts to do what NASA's already been considering. So the only thing that's really different there is the overall arc of the program making more sense and a deeper look at what will be needed. But they have already looked at all these things, so it's not a major change.
Bob, is any of this designed to maybe reinvigorate or excite the general public about this program and going back to the moon?
This is where Isaacman is smarter than I am, because I said let's focus on Earth orbit. The moon is unimportant, and it really is. At least the Artemis program, as previously designed, was very trivial. It was basically just flag and footsteps and nothing else. It was really stupid. But he's kept the lunar part of this that I was originally saying don't waste the time. But what he's done is he's gotten rid of the footprints and flag part of it that was stupid. He's instead focusing on how to build the lunar base and make a permanent presence, which the public's going to like because it's more real. Trust me, people know they can distinguish garbage from reality. That's why they get excited about SpaceX and don't care about the government stuff. They know reality. So this is more real. It's more worked out step by step. Now, of course, you're going to have CNBC reporting $20 billion when that's not the story. But nonetheless, the public will see this and they'll get excited by it. So yes, I think his whole point, which is why he did this instead of what I suggested, is to keep the lunar portion as a more exciting, long-term, settling the solar system project. Set up NASA to provide the framework to allow the American people to settle the solar system. He's not building it by NASA. He's asking the private sector to build it. In many ways, this is once again following, and I've written about this in many of my books. He is copying the framework that the U.S. used in developing the West. In the West, they set up the laws, the territories, the cavalry was there to protect the settlements, but it was the people who moved in and used that framework to make the West a nation, part of the nation. And it's the same thing here. Let the private sector do it with NASA providing the spark plug, the ignition. That's why I said we named this ignition. This is to ignite the private sector to do it. Because it's not NASA that's going to do it, it's the private sector. There is another aspect of this that gets back to my doubts about Isaacman, is he definitely wants to make NASA involved on every step, maybe more than I would like. And the details here are a little vague, but there could be some empire building at NASA. He says, we're going to put NASA people in every one of these projects. We're going to review it. We're going to be paying attention. And to a certain extent, that worries me because in the end, you don't want NASA to own any of this. You only simply want them to get what they ask for, buy it off the private sector. If NASA is going to get involved in developing things with its own engineers, we're then going to be shifting back into the shuttle era and we won't get what we want. So that's a caveat and a risk. And unfortunately, Isaacman has indicated to me that he kind of wants NASA to be this big deal. And so that's a concern. But
That
the overall structure still is beneficial.
that
I'm in
kind of
favor.
concerned me too. We were talking about that before the program started. Not only is he embedding these people in, he's looking for a way to hold these companies accountable to his standards to provide the outcome that he wants. So they have an expected outcome, and the companies have to give them that outcome. That is a government outcome, as I read it. Now, his piece is kind of vague, and you really don't know how he's going to enforce SpaceX to do this and be held accountable. But it seemed to me that, do you really want government outcomes? Or do you want an embedded NASA expert to be the guy directing SpaceX, who has built the space program and probably saved it, to be dealing with the NASA expert? So
I think, I will say that raising this concern and keeping the pressure up on this concern is essential. But I will say this, there's several aspects about this. NASA doesn't have the capability right now, and he admits it. Isaacman admits it. We don't have the capability to do this
do
stuff.
they
We
have the
gotta depend on the
experts in
private
your
sector.
opinion? Do they have
What?
the experts in your opinion?
Who, NASA?
Yeah.
No, absolutely not. NASA does not, and he admits that they have bankrupted themselves. They lost the employees. He's trying to rebuild that. That's a
Build that,
concern of mine
yes.
because it shouldn't be the NASA that does this. He should hire from the private sector who has the expertise. But to address this concern, the program itself is designed in such a way as present that I think the private sector will not be co-opted easily. That doesn't mean it's not a concern. It doesn't mean we shouldn't raise the question, and I'm going to press it, and so will you. But it's designed, I think, that they won't be co-opted easily. And for the reason, and the number one reason why, more than anything else, is because NASA doesn't have the ability to do anything. And SpaceX and Blue Origin, even Blue Origin, and Firefly and Stoke Space and Relativity and Rocket Lab, they actually have the capability to do this. And so NASA's dependent on them to do this stuff. And he's made it clear. He's asking them everybody at NASA was saying this. We're asking the private sector. We want their input. We want their information. They're the ones that know. And so it's going to be them that's controlling the game to a great extent. So I'm just going to lay out how I see it, and I will say the concern is present. I raise it too, but I think that I think the overall design of this program is to the advantage of the American people and not to NASA.
Marshall, go ahead, and then I'm going to move
Okay.
to something
I
else.
was going to ask, isn't he kind of required to have a certain number of NASA people, kind of intermingled into the different companies and the different designs so that he can go back to Congress, ask for more money to, keep NASA going? He's got to have little check marks to show that he's been successful. And I think he can't do it without a few of his people integrated into SpaceX, Blue Origin, Rocket Lab,
It's a Marshall. It's a matter of degree. During one of the things that Isaacman has said in the last few months that concerned me is, all the previous lander problems, the lunar lander problems, and with other programs, we didn't have as much oversight at NASA as we should have. And we should have been much more closely supervising them.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to bring in people who will be skilled to be able to do that because we really don't have that. That's the kind of stuff that makes me concerned from Isaacman.
Me too.
But they always had people involved with the various programs, but NASA was less involved. They allowed the private sector to build their landers and their rockets and other things because that's the idea. Let the ownership belong to the private sector. This is the bottom line concern that David raised, that I raised, that you're raising, that we don't know how much NASA could get involved. If NASA issues a fixed price contract to build a lunar lander by this date to bring these number of payloads to the moon, then NASA should stay out as much as possible, because if they keep making suggested changes, that fixed price contract can't work. And so that's a concern if NASA gets too involved. We have to watch. We're gonna have to wait and see. We don't know. That's the bottom line.
Bob, we've spent an hour talking about the all-day NASA gig. So I suspect something else might be happening in space. I don't really know. This seems to be the big animal in the room, right? But we do have an Artemis 2 flight that's supposed to take place fairly soon. Do you think
A week from now.
a week? Think it'll happen?
They said today that there's no showstoppers right now. It's on the SLS Orion is on the launch pad. It's there. They have no issues that seem like a problem. Their target date is April 1st. They have a launch window through the 6th with what they said today, 4 possible dates within that framework within those 6 days. They didn't mention any later dates. That's their target right now. Will it go? When the Artemis 1 mission tried to launch in the spring of 22 and had continuous fuel leak problems, they had to cancel, scrub it, and they rescheduled for November. When they did do the countdown in November, I was actually completely shocked that they actually launched. They had no launch problems on that actual launch. So it's very possible same thing could happen here. They could go on April 1st. And that's where we stand. I would say that we'll let's just cross our fingers. Who knows?
AJ, I have a point of clarification for you.
Mm-hmm.
Years ago, when the Mars or Moon debates were fierce and occupying too much of everybody's time and attention, people who were championing the moon over Mars would say, the moon has no launch windows. We can go anytime we want, and Mars has this 2-year or so launch window. We can't do that. And yet we see more and more that these lunar plans are coming out with launch windows for the moon, like the one that Bob just talked about. They got a 6-day window for Artemis 2. Can you clarify? I know you're not an orbital dynamics guy, but
I can't.
or Bob, can you?
Go ahead, AJ.
What is the story on a lunar launch window?
The lunar launch windows are okay. We are talking about April 1 to 6, which is it has 4 tries, and after that, within a month, there will be many more. But for Mars, the proximity of Mars is just,
that's another
like
story.
Every 2 years. So that's really much harder. And, even Elon Musk has said the same thing.
So there are windows for the moon. It's just that they're very, very short.
Yeah, let me just insert quickly. Yeah, they just you can launch almost continuously to the moon, depending on where you want to go and what your mission is. It's going to refine your launch window to specific days within a month, but you can launch almost any time. It depends on what your actual mission is going to be. But when it comes to Mars, to get to Mars with chemical rockets, as we presently do, you've got to launch during specific windows every 2 years.
Right.
The Escapade missions have tried a different tact. They've launched outside of those windows, but they're in a holding orbit at a halo orbit, waiting for the launch window to occur, the normal launch window to occur. The SR-1 Freedom mission, that's the nuclear propulsion mission that Isaacman wants to do to the Mars.
Right.
If nuclear propulsion is demonstrated and proved, that will defeat this launch window obstacle for going to Mars, because nuclear engines will have a much greater flexibility with their constant acceleration to get there.
It'll defeat it somewhat, but not quite.
Completely.
Not entirely.
Yeah, because it's still at its furthest point away at
Yeah.
300 plus million miles. That would be a long trip even for a nuclear rocket.
Yeah.
I
Probably
wanted to
travel
make a point.
900 million miles. What, Marshall?
I was wanting to make a point that Apollo had launch windows basically because they wanted to have the angle from the sun to the landing site to be in such a way to optimize visual qualities and cameras and taking pictures and so on like that. So there's some esoteric restrictions in there to
As I
go
say,
by.
it all depends on this, Marshall, it all depends on the specifics of each mission. And in
Yeah.
fact, that same criteria is going to apply to the Artemis landing. They're going to want to land when they have good shadows to make it easier to see hills and details. So
Mhm.
they will not land at high noon. They will land in the afternoon on the moon or in the evening, in the afternoon or in the morning hours with the sun like at 40 degrees elevation. If they go to the South Pole, that's a different story, but they'll have the same kind of issues. But that's just one. There's many others. So yes,
Mhm.
those are the kind of criteria you have to deal with.
Well, there's also the criteria of if you stay there 6 days and then you have to launch back off, you want to make sure the 6 days doesn't run into nighttime because I got a feeling there's a lot of spooky things happen in the dark in the moon. With
Ghosts.
wait a minute, we need a light over here.
Yeah, I mean, once again, this is actually a whole subfield in the world of space. People who actually spend their careers doing this kind of planning and calculations. It's a major, when they did Apollo, one of the reasons Apollo 8 was to prove out that kind of software work, to figure out if they
Mhm.
can do it on the time schedule in the way they wanted to. And so this is a major subtext of the whole space industry that no one ever pays attention to, but it's there and it's important. Um, yeah. So I don't know, David, if you want to go to any place else, if you want to talk about Mars, if you want to talk about,
Well,
I couldn't talk about your Trans-Astra mission if you want.
yeah, Joel Sarcel, who is the CEO, is on Sunday. What do you think of that?
I saw it. I put it up as a quick link on Behind the Black, which is one of those, which is the afternoon thing where I put up, or Jay, my stringer, gives me things that don't necessarily deserve a full post, but they should be noted. And I did that because, to my mind, a lot of this is very preliminary. I'm all for it. Go for it. They've got the investment. They want to demonstrate their capabilities for doing other things like space junk. This is a variation of what the company XLab is doing. XLab is an orbital tug company. It has several orbital tug missions. It signed a contract to launch, I think, I have it on Behind the Black, to launch one of the Nexus orbital tug, I think, on an Ariane 6. They signed this contract a few days ago. But XLab, as another company, they have their own asteroid mission going to Apophis to rendezvous with Apophis when it does its close flyby in 29. So what Trans-Astra is doing is a variation of that. They want to put themselves on the map with something exciting, and doing an asteroid mission like this will demonstrate their capabilities. A lot of the stuff I read about them read to me as extremely preliminary. In other words, they're not quite as advanced. They could prove me wrong. I'd love it if they proved me wrong. And so that's what I think of this at this moment in time.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have one question. Going back a little bit,
Sure.
but the question that I have, the SR-1 mission that they're talking about, nuclear rocket, is that nuclear thermal propulsion or nuclear electric propulsion?
Oh, you get it. From my understanding, it's a variation. You see, now you're using terms, but I don't know the definitions of the terms, so I'm not sure the distinction.
No.
I'll describe what I think they're developing. It's a variation of the Nerva rocket where you're using nuclear fuel to heat up something like water to thrust it out the back very efficiently to produce thrust. That's the basic concept, as I understand it. And
Uh,
that, I don't know which that is under your definition terms, but that's the concept. That's
that's a
as I
nuclear,
understand.
that's a nuclear thermal propulsion, and they would
Yeah.
be using hydrogen instead of water for doing that.
Well, yeah.
Yeah,
When I said water,
yeah,
usually in the earlier tests, water is it's easier to, you use the heat to break up the molecule and then the hydrogen gets thrust out. It's easier to package water on a ship than hydrogen. Some
That's true.
logic.
Right. Yeah.
That's
You're still
how
gonna
I
have oxygen there. Is it 16? No, that's gonna be pretty heavy.
Yeah.
Hydrogen really works the best by a long
You
way.
guys are the engineers, John. I'm guessing, but I don't know.
Hydrogen will give you ISP of the order of 850 seconds, something like that. H2O will give you ISP of the order of 250. So that's
Okay.
really,
What do I know?
Yeah, it won't really beat chemical, really.
yeah. But
No, I understand that. Yes.
Yeah,
In a sense,
nuclear
is it not using the nuclear fuel? Is it not a variation of an ion engine in a sense, except it's using nuclear fuel to be more
that would be nuclear electric propulsion.
Yeah.
That is
Oh, I see.
NEP.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a whole different.
Once again, though, with this whole it's called, I think, Space Reactor One is what the SR stands for.
Yeah. Right.
This whole thing, remember, is as preliminary, maybe even more preliminary than Trans-Astra's asteroid capture mission. I am very skeptical it will happen on their time frame. That doesn't mean it won't happen, but I'm very skeptical on that
The
time.
reason why they have to do it by 2028 is that's when Mars is closest for approach.
But they
That's
don't
the
have, with a nuclear engine, they don't have to, they're not as restricted to those windows as restricted, though they have a much bigger window to work off of.
It's not that much bigger. I mean,
I would suspect it could be it could be 6 to 8 months long, which, think about it, every 2 years is your window. If you have an 8-month window in between, you're eliminating almost all the time you can't launch. And I'm guessing numbers. I'm not the engineer. I can't run the numbers. But based upon everything I've ever read about nuclear power, nuclear thrust like this, it's so much more efficient. It also can it can accelerate continuously like an ion engine can, but it starts out with a greater thrust. So that really reduces your limitations from getting point A to B. And so I would say they have a lot of flexibility there. I would also say, once again, that whether they'll be ready to go is another story entirely.
Yeah. Nuclear electric propulsion can give you ISPs of the order of 10,000, which is really the plus. But the thrust level is just very, very small, extremely small. And that's the problem there. So
right. And I think the nuclear engine has a very large amount instead of that small amount.
Nuclear thermal has a very large.
I think the critical pole, the tall pole that they're going to have is if they want to deploy anything on Mars, these helicopters, the deployment of those helicopters is their big obstacle because this is going to go to the Mars. They said they're not sure if it's going to go in orbit or fly past. They don't know yet. Either way, it's not going to land the helicopters, which means something has got to bring those helicopters down to the surface. And that is the tall pole and the critical path. And that, they skipped that. That was the plot hole in a big movie that you're not supposed to notice. And I noticed it. They don't know how they're going to do that yet. And building that by the end of 28, that's very interesting. They're certainly not going to ask the Russians to provide their landers, and you're not talking about the landing system they used on Curiosity and Perseverance. That wouldn't be the same. I wouldn't think they would do that. It's more expensive. So we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. But that's going to be the tall pole, I think, and it's going to slow this down the most. So let's see. I grabbed your Trans-Astra thing. I should point out something about the moon and water at the poles. And I've covered this on your show. I've been covering this for several years. It is a fact that the press doesn't really cover this very much, but all the data that has looked into the permanently shadowed craters, specifically ShadowCam on the Danuri South Korean orbiter. ShadowCam was an American instrument on that orbiter. It was designed for low light camera work to look in the dark shadows. And every image it has taken and the data that goes with those images has not shown obvious ice or water. It has shown a regolith just like everywhere else. And they just published a paper last week. I posted on Behind the Black. Once again, you should be reading Behind the Black. Posted this on Behind the Black, their paper. This is the third time they've posted a peer-reviewed publication on this particular results. And let me quote, "We found no evidence of widespread water ice in the permanently shadowed regions at abundances above the detection limit of 20 to 30% weight, but could not rule out widespread low content water ice. A few small locations with both high reflectance and forward scattering behavior were observed, which could be consistent with less than 10% water ice." Their conclusion is that if it's there, it's in much lower quantities than expected. And they didn't say this, but I looked at it. If it's there, it's in the soil and it's going to require processing. It's not going to be simple to get. And it'll be in lower quantities than hoped for. So going to the South Pole has advantages with solar power, with the sun being continuous, but the water might not be there. But then again, that's no different than anywhere else on the moon. So the South Pole still has some real estate value, but it might not have the water that we all been imagining. What they need to have is a private company with the capability of capturing a waterlogged asteroid and bringing it to the moon and dumping it near their colony. I hear there's a company that's coming on your show later this week, David, that is developing that technology. So we're in that direction there. That's maybe a solution down the road.
No, I don't think so. I think that if there is water ice, it's probably below, about a few centimeters below what.
Well, their data says no. Their data says it's not. They're not detecting it in high quantities. They're saying that's what they're saying. We want it to be there. One of the reasons, I've gotten pushback every time I report these stories. I'm not the scientist. I report the stories, but I get pushback from scientists, planetary science, who comment on my website, very pissed off that I have said such a thing. There's got to be water there. We want the water to be there. But the data is not speaking well to that conclusion. Now, once again, it's not conclusive. It's definitely uncertain. And so it might be there. But the data isn't, you hope it's below the surface. The data is saying it's not there. At least the data is saying it's there in much lower quantities than believed. After Lunar Prospector and Clementine and the Chandrayaan orbiters, they said, there could be billions of tons. Well, that ain't looking like it's the case. And I'm looking at this like Isaacman, in a sense, that engineering is real. You can't run away from the reality. So if that's the case, well, how do we deal with it? And once again, maybe you need a private company to bring a water-flogged asteroid to their lunar colony. That'll provide you tons of water for years. That's money to be made. Hey, let's make money. And that would be, I think, maybe in the end, the solution. Now, if there is water, AJ, and it's there enough to get a base started, I suspect we're going to find it's not easy to get. It's hard to reach. They pointed out that Shackleton is as deep as the Grand Canyon. So getting down to the bottom is not going to be easy. So in the end, it might still be more cost effective to bring an asteroid that's, an ice material from somewhere and drop it on the moon. Once you're in orbit, the delta V is much less to go to any of these places and come back and forth. So yes, that would be, I think, a much more, might be a more cost-effective thing. But once again, I look at the data, what the scientists are telling me, and I'm going to report it straight. And I'm not going to fantasize about what I hope is there. I don't know what's there.
It may be there, but I mean, it may or may not be there. But I think it's optically looking for something will look only at the regolith, not be able to look inside about, half a meter down or anything like that. So we don't know that. And so,
Granted, it's uncertain. But,
in
yes.
all the programming today, or have you ever read anything, at least quasi-official, on what is the activity this commercial lunar base is supposed to undertake? Is it profitable? Is it government supported? Is it going to be like that for infinity or 2 years or 1 year?
All right. It is a government program. Do you think they have the slightest interest in making money or actually doing anything really productive on the moon? Never came up. It's not being discussed. It's not a factor. But the key to this, and I said this already, is that Isaacman is focusing on having the private sector build this for him. What that does is it ignites, and it's his word, ignites the private sector in space. And the private sector wants to make money, such as data centers on the moon or manufacturing on the moon or in orbit. And so if you energize the private sector so that they can make some money from NASA until they get to the point where they can make money on other things, they will generate the profits later. Let's go back to early 20th century American history. The airplanes that have been built, it exists. The best they can do is barnstorm from farm to town, take people on little flights. They can't make money from it. They haven't been able to convince anyone to use this as a transportation service. So what happens? The government, the Postal Service, hires the plane pilots with their barnstorming planes to deliver the mail. That gives them the investment capital to start to develop the planes that can be passenger planes and cargo planes. And so that's what we're looking at here. Build the space stations. NASA builds its core module with the idea of encouraging private enterprise. And it builds its lunar base with the idea of encouraging private enterprise to help it. And those private enterprise comes along and they start doing other things instead. That's the idea. But the actual lunar base, there was no discussion. This is another plot hole that was supposed to not notice. There was no discussion about what it was actually going to do once it was there, other than be an American colony, a base on the moon. And the bottom line is it's irrelevant. I say it over and over again. I don't want a government program. If this ignites a competitive, independent private sector in space, developing a whole range of other things for profit, then who cares whether the lunar base is there? Truth is, once again, the private sector is moving on its own to the moon. You could have very well, in conjunction with this lunar base, Elon Musk's data center, or Jeff Bezos's dream of putting manufacturing in space instead of on the Earth. That could start happening, but it would be the private sector making the money. NASA it'll once again say, we're here to do science, the science. And there'll be science research, but that's where we're going.
Marshall, what do you want to say?
I was going to ask on purpose about Star Cloud 1 and the AI data centers in space. And there's quite a bit of talk about, well, we could get them really secure if you put them underground on the moon. Of course, you don't have heat sink, but that's one of the big future cash cows of space. And even Elon is talking about $10 billion worth of R&D by SpaceX. So what's your view on it?
All right. Well, Star Cloud, just to reiterate, is a startup. It's done one demo satellite. It's going to do a second demo. So the first demo satellite tested a single processor in orbit to see if it would work. They're going to do a second demo mission, I think, next year that would test a cluster of processors to see if they'd work. They have filed with the FCC to put up an 88,000 satellite constellation data center system. Blue Origin this week also filed an FCC application to put up a 51,000 satellite constellation of its own. SpaceX has submitted its own data center constellation of 1 million satellites. You said cash cow. The key to that is not what's in orbit. The key to that is getting them in orbit. There is going to be an enormous demand for launch services. SpaceX can't meet it, even with Starship, and it's going to want to launch its own million satellites. Blue Origin has its own constellation. It'll want to launch it on New Glenn, but it might not be able to meet that because of New Glenn and not New Glenn, Blue Origin's culture. But Star Cloud's going to need launch services. And so the point I'm getting at is I am still unconvinced these data centers are real as they're predicted. I think we're going to have a lot of shakeout. There's a lot is not going to work. It could be much like the early dot-com bubble in the late 90s. Didn't go away. It's actually expanding now. Starlink is an extension of that, a successful extension of that. But that bubble had a lot of overinvestment and overcommitment that was, they went a little insane. And a lot of people went bankrupt because of that. And so I think the AI data center thing right now is in the insane phase, and a lot of it's going to fail. But in the process, whether or not it succeeds, the demand for launch services is going to be gigantic because they got the investment capital, a lot of insane people on committing money. And so that means they're going to want to launch, which means the money will flow into the launch services. Now, let's take a step away from data centers and look at what the result of that is. You have an incredibly viable, competitive, vibrant launch industry in the United States of many different rockets. Almost all will be completely reusable before we're done. That'll exist with capabilities of lowering the cost to tiny amounts, which will mean, forget about the data centers. We can't even imagine the other industries that'll come out of this because you can get to orbit easily. We're already seeing that happen with what Falcon 9 has accomplished, lowering the cost. And so we'll see some of the same things even exponentially advanced by this. So that's how I look at it. I have no idea if the data centers are going to work. All glory to them for wanting to do it. Some will succeed, some won't, maybe. Maybe none will succeed. But in the process, they're going to put us in space. I think that's the main bottom line.
Once again, we get back to the big paradigm shift of the double catch.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that.
The double catch by SpaceX doing the double catch of the booster and the Starship itself. I mean, that's the paradigm shift.
Well, the paradigm shift was, as far as I'm concerned, was Falcon 9 landing after an orbital launch. That was the paradigm shift because everything else, including using the chopsticks to catch Starship and Super Heavy, using Stokes Space radical second stage nozzle design, using neutrons, Hippo fairing that stays with the first stage. All these are following that paradigm shift of making a rocket completely reusable. And we're not done with just the companies I've just named. There are companies out there we don't even know yet. All the companies right now that are building new rockets are aiming to land their first stage. They're all talking about it that way. So that's the paradigm shift. Everything else, even the chopsticks is the most amazing engineering innovation I've ever seen in my life. But nonetheless, it isn't the actual paradigm shift. It was actually landing the first stage and demonstrating you could still put things in orbit and use fuel to come back and land. That was, I've talked about this and I've been around a long time. And Marshall, you're not as, you might be a baby compared to me. Maybe not. Maybe we're the same age. But either way, I spent decades. David knows this too. We spent decades hearing engineers and managers in the big space launch companies saying it's impossible to land a first stage. It not only won't be reusable, but you'll waste too much fuel and you won't be able to get your payload in orbit. For years they said this. Well, they were wrong. And that's the paradigm shift. So anyway, the rocket industry, I think, because of your question and the data centers, is going to be quite spectacular in the next few years. It will, get back to the space stations. NASA's reservation right now about a market for the space stations. Much of that market problem is the launch cost. Even with the lowering of costs, it hasn't allowed enough business to come out of the woodwork to, in NASA's mind, to fund the space stations privately. But if the cost continues to drop, that obstacle will go away. We'll start to have markets that will want to use those space stations. I also think, by the way, NASA's imagination here might not be as imaginative as they think. VADA once again has brought back pharmaceuticals in orbit that NASA dismissed, that basically blocked for decades, and there's money to be made. And the proof there's money to be made is how much investment capital has been flowing into not just VADA, but a dozen other comparable capsule companies in only the last 2 years. VADA demonstrated it, and now the money's pouring in to build comparable competitive capsules. And that is remember, those capsules are a cheap space station. Once the space stations get cheaper, you can start to do that on the space station manufacturing at larger scales. And that will, I think, happen.
Hey, Bob.
Well, David, we're 90 minutes. I'm always
Yeah,
willing to go
Bob.
2 hours. We always have gone 2 hours. So what
Bob,
else
is
do you
there
want to talk about?
any competition from other countries on space stations? Is there anything worth more than a 5-minute statement?
Well, let me go through them just so we know what's going on.
Yeah.
China has its space station. They've talked about they're going to expand its size. I think that could very well happen. China from the get-go has had a very rational, thought-out program. Isaacman's now trying to bring that to America again, but they've always had a rational program. It's a government program entirely. They've tried to institute a pseudo-profit capitalist system to generate it, and there's some success there. I don't know how long this can go. If China's government goes through a radical change, that could all fall apart. The counter to that is that they have been using their space program as a training ground for the people who run their government. So about, I don't know, half a dozen of the equivalent of their state governors, their province heads, were trained in their space program. So what they're using it like a Kapporkin's exams, like in the old days. And so that space program is interweaved into their governmental culture throughout. And so it makes it more likely it'll stay even if the government changes. But once again, a top-down system, you never know. And it's not profit-based, so there's inefficiencies. So that's China, but they're there and they're serious. Then you got India is trying to build its own space station. And at the same time, they're trying to do the transition to private enterprise. They haven't made that transition yet. They're starting. They're like at NASA was in 2008. And it's a real question whether they can do it, but they're trying. The space station will be a government space station. They have made a deal to work with the Russians. But I think their deal with the Russians is kind of similar with the Chinese deal with the Russians. They're not going to depend on the Russians for anything. Their station is scheduled, I think, to launch in 30 or 32. 30, I think, is the year. The first module may be earlier than that, but the station operational by 30, I think. If you
Uncrewed
have a better,
version, yeah, uncrewed version is going up this year.
the first Gaganyaan is going up. The first module you're saying is going this year? I don't think this year. Maybe next
The
year.
uncrewed version of something is going
All
up.
right, no, what you're thinking of is the Gaganyaan capsule is going to do uncrewed missions. That's just the manned capsule. That's like Orion or Dragon. They're going to do unmanned missions. They're going to do an orbital mission next year. The first full module of their BAS, I'm not going to tell you, I can't pronounce the Indian names for the BAS station, but the first module, I think, is scheduled to launch maybe in 28. The operational full set of modules for the full station, I think, is 30 is their goal. Once again, these are Elon Musk numbers. It could be delayed, but nonetheless, India is pushing, and I think India is solid, and I think they're going to do something, whether it's government or private. I think something will happen. Russia proposes it's going to do something. Russia, we'll see. Russia is bankrupt and is bankrupting itself in the Ukraine. Whether it can actually recover from that, I have no idea. Their track record since the fall of the Soviet Union is they promise a lot and nothing gets built for decades. Whatever was built at the end of the Soviet Union took decades to launch, and there wasn't much. So it's hard to predict what will actually happen with them. A good guide to how they function is their launch this week of their first 16 satellites of their RASVET Starlink copycat constellation. It's supposed to have 700 satellites total, and they hope to have them all in orbit by 2035. 9 years hence, 700 satellites. SpaceX can launch about 700 satellites in about 2 months at most. And actually, I think Amazon will start launching in those kind of numbers in the next year or so, at least close to that. So this constellation from Russia, by the time it's fully deployed, it'll be completely obsolete. It's mainly a jobs program. They don't really have it viable. So their space station, who knows what's going to happen after ISS goes away. We have the 5 American space stations that are under development, competing for that NASA money. What is going to happen now with those 5 stations is going to play out, I think, over the next 6 months, because they're going to have to rethink their plans based on what NASA is proposing right now. And all of them are actually all of them. Well, let me think about this a minute. All of them are designed in a way, except Axiom is designed almost like the core module that NASA is proposing, so they can function in that area. Haven is building modules. It could conceivably attach its modules to the core stage as an interim step before it starts to assemble its own station. The Thunderbird station by Max Space is an inflatable module. It could just simply be launched and attached to that core module, so it can work with that. The orbital reef station, whatever Blue Origin's doing is nothing. But the Sierra Space half of that is inflatable modules, and they could, on their own, maybe launch to the core module and latch onto this. Starlab, which I like for a lot of reasons, and they seem to have a lot of European customers. They might end up to be a European space station in the end because they're tied to ESA and Airbus. And Mitsubishi is with them as well. That's a single module, very large station being launched on Starship. It might not work with the core module that NASA is doing, but it could be that Starlab could shift and try to make Europe become the European station. So that's I'm guessing there. I'm theorizing based on what I know of the stations. I don't know how they can work with the core module concept that Isaacman has proposed now. They would have, I think, more difficulties. Axiom is interesting because it's almost like Isaacman's stolen their idea and it's inserted it onto ISS. So I don't know where they go. Are they supplanted, or are they going to bid to do it for NASA? That might be what happens. They might have to reconfigure their own initial module to put those ports in, but that's maybe relatively trivial engineering-wise. I'm not the engineer. So those are the stations, David. That's where we stand. I don't know of any other off the top of my head, I can't think of any other stations being developed right now by anybody. If someone can think of something, tell me, but I don't think so. I mean, I keep tab on this very closely, and that's, I think,
Before we say goodnight, I have two other things I want a progress report on. Lunar spacesuits and our technology once we get to the moon, and rovers that can move us around on the moon. What we get to the moon, number one, no one knows what the habitat's going to do. But okay, so maybe they go out and take weather readings or something for the government. I don't know. But then, do they have lunar spacesuits yet? And are they being tested, or they're?
Yeah, let me get to this. I can answer.
And then also, how are we going to move around on the moon?
The rovers. Well, I'll get to this. NASA had initially issued 2 contracts for building spacesuits to replace the old ones that NASA's been using now for so long and couldn't replace. Spent $1 billion plus wasting 14 years doing PowerPoint. This is part of that $20 billion they wasted. So they hired 2 companies. One has backed out, couldn't get the job done. That was Collins Space. They couldn't get the job done. They backed out of the contract. The other company is Axiom. Axiom's building the suits. They've tested those suits in the tanks. They've gone through almost all the testing necessary. They are good night, AJ. They're on. I was going to ask AJ to maybe help answer your question, but all right, I'll go through it. And so they're doing that. And so that's one suit. And the next Artemis mission, Artemis 3, the goal is to test that suit in Orion, maybe as an EVA on that mission in orbit. Now that suit was originally designed as a space station suit, but NASA's upgraded the contract to make it dual use for maybe on the moon as well. NASA has also issued contracts to a bunch of different private companies to develop rovers for manned operations on the moon. These are preliminary contracts similar to the space station preliminary contracts. NASA is going to issue a major contract for the actual construction. So these companies are competing to convince NASA to give them the big contract. With this new program, that could change. It could be that NASA will rethink how it's going to award the contracts. Maybe 2 contracts. Who knows? I don't know. But they talked about rovers at length, various types of rovers at length in the development of those phases of the lunar base. So they're thinking on those terms as well, David, without question. One company I want to insert in terms of habitats, one, Max Space and Starlab have partnered to propose building their own lunar habitats using Max Space's inflatable module, and Starlab would provide the base, the foundation, and the airlock. And they've already put forth preliminary designs of such a project. They were anticipating that they're going to be contractors needed to build the habitats on the moon at some point, and they want to be positioned to bid for those contracts. Now, once again, this is getting back to your earlier question about what will they do on the moon? Well, if a private company builds a module for NASA to put its science experiments on the moon, it surely can sell payload space racks on that habitat for manufacturing and other purposes on the moon, data centers and so forth. So there's profit centers there for the private sector, as long as they own what they build for NASA so that they're free to do other things. One of the paradigms of the International Space Station was crippling. You could not manufacture a product on ISS for sale later. And that, because NASA was the owner and NASA can't be involved in helping any specific company succeed. Well, the stations will be owned privately. So there will be an opportunity for others to do that. And that's we hope. And this gets the caveat: how much control will NASA dictate to these privately operations? And we'll have to watch that play out politically over the years.
So, final question is Isaacman acting as the chief coordinator to bring all of these needed technologies that are being independently developed, lunar rovers, spacesuits, whatever else might be, together so that they merge at the same time? Or are there going to be big lags? We can get to the moon, but we don't have a spacesuit. We can get to the moon, but we don't have a rover.
You're asking the kind of questions that they admitted they're asking themselves right now as they develop this, which is why they're asking for requests for information from the private sector, including the rover companies that competed for rovers, including spacesuit companies. You know, SpaceX could become a spacesuit company because it's already developed several spacesuits. So we could start competing for these kind of contracts too. So you're asking the right questions, and I think they're asking those questions themselves right now. They admitted to that. Which is healthy, which is why this is a good step, because they're asking questions. They're no longer dictating a stupid program that made no sense. They're asking intelligent questions and how to structure the program that can get something accomplished. So that's all I can tell you with that, David. I just think you're asking the right question, but I think they ought to.
AJ, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, yeah, you are right, Bob. And thanks very much for today's thing was very good. And I'm sorry that I have to go, but I haven't had dinner yet, and I'm in the East Coast, but I would want to make 2 points. One is that the phase 1 of lunar base is going to talk about, or is going to be requiring, uncrewed lunar rovers, and I think in phase 2 they are talking about crewed lunar rovers. So it's going to be in that way. Another thing I wanted to bring up is that in phase 1, they are going to use RTGs for heat and for electricity and all that kind of a thing at a much smaller level, obviously, RTGs only, HUDs. And in phase 3, I think that they are talking about putting a fission reactor there, So those are the only 2 points I want to make. Other than that, good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night.
And Bob, thank you very much. When I get dates made, we'll plan something for maybe May, something like that.
May, whatever.
June.
I'm open. I'm a loudmouth. I'm always want to talk. It's anytime.
Absolutely.
But if people want to know what I'm talking about on a daily basis, they can go to Behind the Black and read every day. I'm never shutting up. So that's and AJ, how many times did you say I was right today?
He's already off.
I'm just joking.
Anybody have a closing comment who is left with us tonight? We're pushing 2 hours. So Sherry, you were pretty quiet. Anything you want to say to Bob?
I don't think she's here anymore.
Well, her picture's here.
I don't see it, but that's all right.
I'm here.
Okay.
I'm here. I just don't have anything to say, but thank you. Yeah, it's always very informative.
All right, Sherry.
All right,
Thank you.
and John Hunt, anything from you?
Nothing particular. Interesting show. Well, a lot of information.
Thank you.
Okay.
Marshall, you've been talking, so you're probably all talked out.
Not quite. I'll push out a
Oh,
few more words. Uh, uh, One of the things that I see, and you've done very well, Robert, is coming in there and taking a large view of what everybody's doing and seeing how it fits together.
Mm.
And that's, in many cases, there's a lot of people with just little ideas that can't go anywhere without the infrastructure. And you kind of fill out the infrastructure and you're a good critic of it. So
Well,
that's about as good a compliment as I can produce.
well, I really appreciate that. I want to just emphasize I'm not an engineer, so I don't focus on those little engineering things. I'm a historian. And what is a historian? And in me particular, if you read my books, my interest is always a much greater, larger scale perspective. Almost all my books talk about how societies have changed and how the space program has changed societies, both the United
Mhm.
States and the Soviet Union and Russia, and how the future space effort, building colonies, will evolve societies over time. So I'm always taking a larger view. It's by nature. If you uh, I'm always looking at the larger context and not in the specific engineering because I'm not an engineer. So it's natural for me to do that. And I will say once again, one of my complaints, I started to write my histories, Marshall. One of my complaints is that all the histories about the 60s space program always left out the political world aspect of that program and that whole Cold War thing. And that's like you're not telling the story then. And so that's the greater view. And so
Mhm.
I always take the greater view. And so that gives me the ability to look at things that I think others don't see. Um, with the modern mainstream press, they have a problem that a lot of their reporters are just generally not well educated anymore to a greater view. And it's not their fault. The academia has been a failure for the last 30 years. So they don't have a deeper view, and that limits them. Also, even if they did, the mainstream press no longer has people on specific beats anymore. And so if you go to like CNBC or CNN or AP or UPI, you're generally going to get an ignorant reporter who doesn't follow that beat. Generally, it's maybe going to change in a few places, but generally, if you want to get the beat reporting, you've got to go to places like Space News or NASAspaceflight.com or Ars Technica. But all of them focus on the close view much more than I do. I take the larger view. I'm coming from a historian, which is why I say read Behind the Black, because you get a different perspective. I have to plug my site. I'm sorry.
All right, and I say read it too and support Bob. He not only has been a great space show asset and friend, but he's got a really good service and his books are pretty good. So we give him credit for giving him credit, and he's containing himself on the politics. So I applaud him for that.
Well, the politics, David. In this case, the politics are part of the story, and I talked about it actually, which is how Isaacman has played the politics very wisely
Very
to get
well,
what he
yeah.
wants. You know, who knows who will be next president? That'll change things maybe.
Well, all right, Bob, until the next time, and
Till
everybody
next time.
else, thank you for being here.
Thank you all
And
for being
listeners,
here. I
thank you
appreciate it.
for joining in, and good night from all of us here at the Space Show.